Every culture and country has their own odd little quirks, and China, the most populous country on the planet, is no different. With over 18% of the total people on the planet living in the ex-communist state, it's safe to say some of their practices could come across as a little strange. Today we're talking about the weirdest things that people in China do that foreigners find a little strange. Stay tuned. First up, we're talking about the slightly odd diet. If you've been to China, you will have noticed that some Chinese people have no problems chowing down on what the rest of us would never dream of eating: bugs. It was assumed that the practice came from years of hardship under Chairman Mao, but it stems back much farther than that. Edible insects have been eaten in China for centuries and were seen as a sort of mountain treasure food back in the day. People still eat them today as a way of adding natural food in their diet. Obviously, insects contain no added chemicals or preservatives, and Chinese people even say they're delicious. And insects are not the only slightly strange thing the Chinese population don't mind eating. Some other things include fish eyes, cow stomach, and chicken feet. What do you guys make of this practice? Have you ever eaten insects? Let us know below. Next up, it's the incessant smoking. Stay tuned. Smoking has become largely socially unacceptable in most countries around the world over the past couple of decades, but not China. The practice is still seen as acceptable in most places, even indoors. Some smokers even have no problem smoking in elevators, which is, quite frankly, gross. The population still sees smoking as a social custom, and giving cigarettes is seen as a sign of respect and friendliness. Pretty wild. Are you a smoker? What's it like for you now the world has largely shunned the practice? We're talking about excessive volume when talking now. For one reason or another, Chinese people tend to talk at insanely high volumes. It is thought that it could be down to the fact that the Chinese language depends largely on tone to convey meaning properly, but even in small, crowded spaces where foreigners would be mortified to shout and let strangers know their business, Chinese people have no problem shouting. This practice can be one of the more annoying ones, as the Chinese population have been known to raise the volume in more traditional, quiet places, like buses and airplanes. A truly annoying habit. So be aware of this one before planning your trip to China. Now we're talking about the lack of queuing. Stick around. While most of the rest of the world are used to lining up formally and quiet, don't expect this practice to extend to China. Anywhere people would usually form orderly queues, bus stations, airports, coffee lines, wherever really, crowds will just amass and fight their way to the front of the line. This can actually be quite dangerous, especially if you happen to be an older person. But Chinese people do not seem to care. They tend to just look out for themselves and have turned rushing lines into an actual sport. What do you make of this one? Let us know below. We're discussing chopsticks next. This one might come across as a little strange, but there's actually a strong taboo when it comes to the placement of chopsticks. When it comes to using chopsticks, some people are a little, shall we say, unpracticed, especially if you happen to be a foreigner. One easy way to get around this is to just stick the chopstick into your food to stop it falling from your grip. Chinese people, however, will never do this, as apparently it's reminiscent of the placement of incense at a funeral and is thought to be an omen of death. Creepy. Be sure not to do this on your trip, as it could incur a few unpleasant glances. Refusal is up next. When in China, you might notice a slightly odd practice of people refusing things, sometimes, many times, before they eventually accept. But this is the norm. It is seen as polite to initially refuse something before accepting, as gift giving is a huge part of the culture in China. It is seen as taboo to just accept something without at least refusing it once. People will sometimes even refuse things a second time too, but this is all just a facade, a sort of cultural game that's played on the road to acceptance. The same idea is also true when somebody gives a compliment. At first, it's seen as polite to refuse the compliment, as if you accept it too quickly, you could be called vain. For people that are often seen as being pretty rude, this might be seen as a pretty odd one. We're discussing some quite terrible habits now: bodily functions. Stay with us. To be fair, this one is not just China. This also happens a lot in Korea, too. For some reason, people in Eastern Asia have absolutely no problem hawking up a large amount of phlegm and spitting all over the street. It is an absolutely disgusting habit and is incredibly rude, especially to just do it in the street in front of other people, but the Chinese people don't see it that way. The Western world in particular can be pretty squeamish when it comes to bodily functions, but this hasn't really caught on in East Asia, as people will will openly pass wind in public too, which is obviously just a normal part of life, but the spitting thing, we just do not get. There's nothing worse than having to walk down the street and dodge piles of spit. Gross. Whilst people have no problem spitting all over the streets, the same can also be said for urinating. Expect to see a large portion of men peeing all over the street during your trip. What do you guys make of these? Let us know below. Dodging the sun is up now. Stick around. In the West, it's seen as a sign of health, or sometimes even wealth, to sport a golden-looking tan. But this is not the case in China and East Asia. Traditionally, tanned, weather-beaten skin is associated with manual labor, so don't expect the Chinese to strip down to their swimwear at the beach. Quite the opposite, really. Some folks have been known to wear long shirts and trousers while enjoying a day at the seaside, and some people will even take it as far as wearing a garment known as a face kini. This is basically just a ski mask, designed to keep the sun off of one's face, which actually looks pretty hilarious. We're talking personal space now. Stay tuned. If you ever do head off to China on holiday, prepare to say goodbye to your personal space. As we mentioned earlier, in public spaces, Chinese people have no problem not queuing for things and will just push other people out of the way, using bags or whatever they have in hand and not bother apologizing. In the West, this is a big no-no, and if you do happen to cut someone up in public, or even worse, barge into them, most people would be mortified and apologize profusely. Not in China. Be prepared for people to just barge into you without even acknowledging what they've done. Now we're talking about their lack of appreciation for red lights. Feel free to just cross the street at any time of day, as red lights in China are more of a guideline than an actual enforced law. It is one of the few places on Earth, another being Peru, where crossing the street is just as dangerous when the traffic lights are green than when they're on red, so do so at your own peril. We're discussing ghost cities next. Don't go anywhere. In China, there are dozens of uninhabited cities, which are home to an estimated 60 million deserted houses. The reason is largely unknown, but the government has claimed it's just due to the fact that a lot of time it takes a while between buildings being built and the population making the city their home. There are tons of these cities throughout China, and it seems as though these places would be a perfect setting for a post-apocalyptic TV show or movie. And finally, we're discussing the obsession with foreigners. Chinese people, especially in rural areas, can go years without seeing a foreigner, and in the more secluded highlands and western parts of the country, some people might never have seen a foreigner at all. When you land in China, be prepared for not only a few glances or even stares in your direction, but for people to actively approach you and request a photograph. After being a closed society for so long, Chinese people are fascinated with all things Western, so prepare yourself to stick out like a sore thumb, especially if you're a little bit taller than most. A lot of Chinese people will assume you are some sort of celebrity, so don't be surprised to have a camera stuck in your face, sometimes without even asking. As always, thanks for tuning in today, and don't forget to stop by next time for some more fun and games. Also, remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Bye, guys.